for someone who says, look, I want the Sweden model. I want paid daycare. I want fully paid education. Okay, I think then the answer is okay. So you want a 25% national sales tax. And if the answer is no, then I think it's okay. So tell me how you're going to raise that kind of revenue without creating a disincentive for business investment, entrepreneurship, and business development more broadly.
Ideologies of Socialism podcast, where we talk about what socialism is, what it isn't, and what socialism has been like in reality in the places where it's been implemented. I'm your host, Rosemarie Fike, and today I'm joined by Jason Clemens. Jason is the Executive Vice President of the Fraser Institute and the President of the Fraser Institute Foundation. He's published over 70 major studies on a wide range of topics. He's published over 300 shorter articles, which have appeared in newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, Washington Post, Globe and Mail, and more. For the purposes of today's conversation, Jason is the co-author of Perspectives on Capitalism and Socialism, polling results from Canada, the United States, Australia, and the UK, which he wrote with Fraser Institute Senior Fellow Steve Globerman. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about your work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation because I think it's kind of a popular narrative that younger generations seem to be enamored with socialism. And so, but I think the story that you present in your work is a lot more complicated than that. And so this is a really important conversation to have. And so I typically start by asking each guest to define what they mean by socialism for listeners, especially people who might be tuning in for the first time. And for this conversation, I think it's especially important.
No, that's right. In fact, there's a whole section of our study which actually deals with this very question. So as an economist, I'm trained to think about socialism by the actual definition, which would be the government, well, technically the government owning the means of production, which simply means that the state, rather than entrepreneurs and business people and laborers, are making economic decisions. It's centralized in the government and they actually own businesses and industries. So that's the technical or dictionary definition. However, as we know, language evolves, and clearly what has happened is an evolution of what is meant by socialism. And that's certainly borne out in our polling data. And as you've already done a podcast with Professor Jim Otteson, had a wonderful discussion. Certainly now, when we talk about socialism, particularly if we're talking about it versus capitalism, it's really a spectrum based on who's making economic decisions. And so I think the modern definition of socialism is about the state making more economic decisions, whether that's providing more goods and services or providing a minimum income or redistributing more. What it, I think, is less about is the government actually owning businesses outright.
I know when I have these conversations with my students, they seem surprised that the traditional definition of socialism means that there is no private property over the means of production. There are no private businesses. And when they seem to suggest that they're interested in socialism, that is definitely not the kind of socialism that they're talking about. So before we dig into the details, can you tell me a little bit about what are some of the big findings that came out of this research?
Sure. So like the other polls that we looked at, there is clearly a level of support for socialism, interestingly, both amongst all respondents, so that's all age groups, but more poignantly for younger respondents. So if we look at the 4 countries and we look at all age groups, the level of support for socialism ranges from 31% in the United States, which is the low, to 43% in the UK. Canada was 1 point back at 42%. If we only look at 18 to 24-year-olds, which again, we oversampled young people because that was our key point of interest, the levels are higher. So, for example, in the United States, the level of support for socialism goes from 31% for everyone to 45%. So almost half of respondents who are 18 to 24. The range of results are from the US for 18 to 24-year-olds from 45% to 53% in Australia, with both Canada and the UK at or above 50%. So again, in general, we are seeing a decent level of support for socialism across all age groups, but particularly for younger people. And then when you break it up into the 4 age categories that we have the data for, it's almost a straight line down. So simply put, the older you are, the lower level of support we see for socialism. Before we ask them how to define it, just the term socialism. So clearly there's an age effect. The older you are, the lower the support's going to be for socialism.
So that's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about what might be driving that trend? Why it seems like the support for socialism declines with age?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on. One of which is probably more important when we talk about, if you want socialism, someone has to pay for it, which I think we'll talk about later. But I think a couple things are going on. One, if you're my age, so slightly over 50, I vividly remember socialism. Like I remember watching newscasts of the Berlin Wall and people, these just horrific stories of people trying to escape from the Soviet bloc. I remember seeing newscasts about people defecting and getting out because it was so bad. And so I have memories of and remember asking teachers, like, how can a system be so bad that they have to build walls and not allow people to travel outside because they so yearn to escape? And then similarly, I remember the fall of the wall, and I remember the fall of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union, and the joy and jubilation that we saw in people finally being able to travel and experience freedom, for lack of a better phrase, and in other words, in being able to make self-determining decisions that under that social system they were prevented from. And so to me, the difference between younger people who don't live in that world, they just simply cannot go on the news or search the internet and look at real world examples that are prominent. I remember, for my age group, there were really two competing systems that had a substantial portion of the population globally. Whereas now, essentially, you've got China, which is a mixed system. You've got Cuba and North Korea, but we don't have all of the Russian or Soviet bloc countries competing. So I think, for lack of a better phrase, I think there's a difference in the lived experience of people. The older you are, simply put, you remember what that experiment was like and the real hardship it imposed on those that suffered from it. So I think that history or lack thereof is part of the explanation. I think the second one is just natural. I think it's Churchill who made the quote that if you're young and you're not a socialist, you don't have a heart, and if you're older and you're not a conservative, you don't have a brain. And so I just think as a young person, there is an idealism about things like equality. I think there's an assumption that socialist systems are more equal when I think the experience is very different. But I think part of that is just the natural idealism of young people. I think the third thing, though, which is the factor maybe we'll talk about later, who's going to pay the price of socialism, is that across most countries, younger people tend to work less. And if they work less hours. So a smaller percentage of young people are working part-time. And if they work part-time, it's less hours, which means they're not having the experience of payroll deduction and personal income taxes. And they're not directly seeing the cost of government activity in the form of taxation. And so I think this, which again is a larger trend of separating the cost of government in the form of taxes from whatever government does in terms of providing services or income transfers. That separation, I think, creates a natural constituency for people who want more government. And so I think that's part of what's going on with young people.
Yeah, I see that from myself. I'm almost 40, so I vaguely remember kind of the fall of of communism, and it's still there. Some of my cultural references are still in that Cold War era, but I also went to college at a time where lots of people wore Che Guevara t-shirts and kind of romanticized the whole process. And as I get older and own a house and have to do things like pay property taxes, I care a lot more about, what services my tax dollars are paying for. So that makes a lot of sense. Do you think, or are you concerned at all about this trend where over half of the population of young people do seem to at least have some level of support for socialism?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's two answers. There's the short term and the longer term. The short term answer is my level of concern relates to the level of misinformation or misunderstanding, particularly when people define socialism and they assume, and the United States has a senator and several members of Congress who talk about adopting the Scandinavian model as their socialist model, but have not even a superficial understanding of that model, because what they advocate for is markedly different than the Scandinavian model of what they call social or democratic socialism. So my concern would be people are saying we support X, but really don't understand what X is. I think the second concern, which frankly, we don't know right now, is if we fast forward 10 years and we look at someone who's 22 or 23 or 24, and they're now working more, are we still seeing this declining trend? So right now, we see clearly the older you are, the lower the support for socialism. Will that continue? Or will the young people today who have a higher level of support than, say, 10 years ago, will that sustain itself into their 30s and 40s and 50s? Which, if that's the case, then it seems to me we will see much more fundamental change in the role of government. And the answer right now is we don't know. I mean, we will have to see that unfold over the next 10 or 20 years.
So do you plan on doing a follow-up study down the road to kind of track, those trends?
I think it's a great question. I mean, we've certainly talked about it. The question for us would be, what's the state of policy in 8 years or 9 years or 10 years? And equally as important is the degree to which we can capture people, which, as you know, is difficult, who were predisposed to socialism 10 years ago.
Right.
Because that, to me, that's part of the key is looking at people, particularly young people, who, yes, said, I was very supportive of socialism when I was 25. I'm now 35 and I'm no longer supportive. That's going to be key in that type of research.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on a little bit to kind of the second part of your study. So the first, you kind of look at the support for socialism and really emphasize that it's younger populations that have the strongest support. And then you move on to talk about definitions of socialism. So can you give us a sense of what people really mean when they say they support socialism?
Sure. So this was one of the things that differentiated our study from most of the other surveys that, at least that we looked at when we were doing the original research, which is almost none of the surveys we looked at actually asked people, well, what do you mean by socialism? They just asked people, are you supportive of it? And so what's actually quite important is when we ask people, are you defining socialism using the traditional definition, that is the government owning businesses and industries, such that the government, rather than entrepreneurs and businesses, direct the economy? So we really focused on who are making the economic decisions. regardless of age or country, it doesn't get over 50%. So the highest level of support for the traditional definition of socialism was 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK at 46%. If you look at people over 55, for example, that ranges from 18% in the United States to 35% in the UK. So again, across all age groups and all 4 countries, while there is a level of support for the actual socialism that we went through, it certainly is not overwhelming. Again, none of them are over 50%. We offered 2 other definitions. So the second definition was government is going to provide more services. So healthcare, daycare, K-12 education, post-secondary education. Those results are just a magnitude higher than the support for traditional socialism. So if you look at 18 to 34-year-olds, again, support levels go from 56% in the UK to 72% in Australia. You see much higher levels of support across all age groups. And in fact, all of the responses across all major age groups for all 4 countries is above 50%. So it gives you a sense of how much stronger the support for socialism as defined by government providing more services is relative to the traditional definition of socialism. The third definition we offered was the government would guarantee an annual income. So we basically phrased it as every person would be guaranteed a certain amount of income each year provided by the government. The results for that are also quite strong, though not as strong as defining it as government providing more services. Those results, depending on the age group, are roughly from low 50s to mid 60s or so. The one exception is people over 55 in the United States, where it was only 35% who defined socialism as a guaranteed annual income. So essentially, when we think about how are the respondents defining socialism, most are defining it as government providing more services, slightly less government providing a guaranteed annual income, and then way down would be defining it as the government actually owning industries and businesses, which frankly is quite in line with people like Senator Bernie Sanders and a number of Congress people in the United States, and in fact socialists here in Canada and the UK, who are not advocating for government taking over industries. They're advocating for the government to do a whole lot more in providing services, and in some cases providing a guaranteed annual income.
I know when I was in college and considered myself a supporter of socialism, I was certainly thinking of the government being like a bigger social safety net and targeting things like inequality. So that at least kind of fits with my experience and with the conversations I've had with my students. But that's interesting because it kind of makes it difficult to have conversations from academics versus policy people versus the average person. We might just be talking past each other if we continue to use this traditional socialism language. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think that's entirely correct. That there's a real risk / maybe even more than a risk, a probability that when one set of people is saying, well, socialism, we have real world evidence that it doesn't work. I mean, pick your country, pick your time period, and here are all the reasons, whether it's control or knowledge or incentive problems, that centrally planning economies just doesn't work. And the other person is saying, well, but that's not even what I'm talking about. And so, in many ways, I think this is kind of the classic, let's first define our terms before we have our discussion, which I wish we were in a world where that was easier to do. But I do think when we're having this debate and people throw out the term socialism, it's really about how are we defining that. And I mean, I can just share an interesting experience we had, which we wrote about 6 or 7 months ago, a piece asking the question whether Canada's current prime minister is a socialist. And we really were trying to play on this idea of an evolving definition of socialism, which is using the traditional definition, no. But if you use the modern definition, then he clearly has a predisposition towards socialism because he's expanded programs, created new programs, as is in line with the definition for modern socialism. So I do think your insight is an important one about if you're going to have a discussion about socialism, you better start with what do you mean by socialism?
Every single episode of this podcast series starts with how are we defining socialism for exactly that reason. Now let's turn our focus to people's opinion regarding how do we finance socialist systems. What kind of options were survey respondents presented with, and where did they seem to fall regarding those options?
Sure. So this is the only survey that we're aware of who actually attached a cost of, so who's paying for this? So we purposefully designed it in a way where there were 4 options. 2 of the options were designed so that most respondents, if not almost 99% of respondents, would interpret it as someone else is going to pay that tax. And then 2 options where it was designed that clearly the respondents were going to pay the tax. So the 4 options were a new wealth tax on the top 1%, higher personal income tax rates, but only on the top 10%, higher personal income tax rates on everyone except for very low income. And then depending on your country, it was either a new national sales tax or a higher national sales tax. So this is important for listeners in the United States because obviously you don't have a national sales tax. So the wording was the introduction of a 20% national sales tax in the United States. In Canada, it was worded as a much higher national sales tax because while we have a national sales tax, it's actually very low at only 5%. And then in Australia and the United Kingdom, it was worded as a much higher national sales tax because they both have a fairly high national sales tax now. The results are actually quite telling. And again, it goes back to this idea of separating out my preference for more government activity, more government spending versus I don't want to pay the cost of that decision. Mm-hmm. So overwhelmingly, again, regardless of age group or country, overwhelmingly the support was for the 2 tax options where most, if not all, respondents would not interpret those as being higher taxes for themselves. So for a wealth tax, for example, again, a brand new wealth tax only on the top 1%, support ranged from 66% in the United States to 72% in Canada and Australia, which, those over 70% is quite high when you're looking at survey data. You see a bit of a bump down when we look at higher personal income taxes, but only for the top 10. That ranges from 53% in the United Kingdom to 59% in Canada. Again, that's across all ages. You then see a pretty pronounced drop for higher personal income taxes for most citizens. That's only 31% in Canada to a high of 39% in Australia. And then, frankly, the results just collapse. When we look at a national sales tax, support for that across all ages is 16% in Canada. Interestingly, to 29% in the United States. The reason I say it's interesting is because you don't have a national sales tax.
Yeah.
So for the 3 countries,
sales taxes, different states have different, but we don't have anything on the national level.
That's right. Yeah. So, for in Canada, the national sales tax is the most hated tax because we see it on everything we purchase. We see that little line that says GST. So it was interesting that the US had the high, again, not high in an absolute sense, but higher relative support for a national sales tax in the sense that you don't have a national sales tax. And as you know, there are several states that have no state level sales tax.
Yeah. Yes, I'm from Pennsylvania, so we had no state sales tax on a lot of things. So it is interesting to me, right? Because socialism sounds nice if it's a free lunch, but if we have to actually put our money where our mouth is, people are less keen to do that. I think that's kind of the the heart of the Churchill quote that you brought up. When you're older and you're paying for these things, it's a lot harder to commit to those ideals. So do you have any thoughts about kind of the patterns you observed with regards to this support, these financing schemes?
Well, you certainly, I think one thing jumps out, and it's actually a broader concern, I think, for a lot of economists, certainly for myself, which is this separation of what I want the government to do from who's going to pay it. And again, so we've got fairly high support, mid to high 60s on, we define socialism as government providing more services. We've got decent level of support for socialism generally, but when it comes to who's paying it, particularly as economists, the most efficient way to do it would be a national sales tax. It's just plummeting in terms of 16 to 25, 29% are willing to pay that national sales tax. What they want is someone else to pay for it. And so this disconnect, or this separation of, I want A, B, and C, but I don't want to pay for A, B, and C, I think is not only disconcerting from a public policy perspective, but I think critically, it's not the Scandinavian model. And so when you have political leaders in the United States, Canada, and the UK, and probably Australia, when you have them advocating for quote unquote social democracy based on a Scandinavian model, and then you look at the details of what they're proposing and it's not the Scandinavian model, I worry about young people saying, well, no, but this works in Denmark or this works in Sweden. And you're like, yeah, but it doesn't, because what you're advocating for is fundamentally different than the Swedish or Danish models. So I think that's a really important issue when it comes to policy. And in fact, I mean, we see this in other polls that have been done in Canada, and I'm sure in other countries where, and in fact, I think it's a major problem in polling where you say, are you supportive of a new service or expanded program? And you get the results, but you've never said, right, but what's the cost of doing that? And as economists, you can say you want a whole bunch of stuff, but unless you're willing to pay the price of those actions, I'm not sure we put a lot of faith or validity in those responses, because they're essentially based on an assumption that there's no trade-off, that I can do these things in a costless way.
Right. That's one of the things I was thinking as you were talking. In a different episode of this podcast, I do have a conversation with Johan Norberg about the Scandinavian model and what that really entails. And I think the biggest thing that I learned is that it's financed. Basically, you're paying for it yourself over the course of your lifetime. You're redistributing to yourself during times when you are lower income earner from when you're higher income earner. And I don't think that is very clear to many people who say they support the Scandinavian model. I also love to point out to my students who talk about Denmark and Scandinavian countries, I tell them, you need to look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index. A lot of those countries rank very highly, sometimes higher than the United States and Canada on that index, showing that the vast majority of decisions are being made through the market process, not through the political process.
Yeah, I think you've raised two really, really important points. So the first, if you look at Denmark and Sweden, the two major taxes that they rely on to finance their much higher levels of government spending, and they do have higher levels of government spending. One is national sales tax at 25%. They both have a 25% called a VAT. It's a national sales tax. Mm-hmm. That's important because the support for national sales tax, as we just talked about, is very low across all four countries, across all age groups. The second tax that they rely on are fairly high personal income tax rates that are applied at relatively low levels of income. Mm-hmm. So the reason that second part is really important is that in Canada and the United States, and to some extent the UK, We have high tax rates, but they don't kick in until very high levels of income. So in Canada, it's about 176,000 US. Depending on your state, top rates can kick in at about 500,000 US. In Sweden, for example, it's about 76,000 US. So in a country like Sweden, middle-class workers, many middle-class workers have part of their income at the top tax rate.
Mm-hmm.
And so as Johan wrote in his study and apparently talked about in the podcast, it really is essentially you are lending to yourself when you're young, you're paying it back when you're working, and then you're drawing down when you are older. And so that model is just so different from what is being advocated in Western countries like Canada and the United States, where we want all those programs, but we don't want a national sales tax and we don't want higher personal income taxes for average workers. We just want a very small group to pay for it, as if one, there's enough money there to pay for those things, and two, that there's no incentive effects for those people.
Yes, I can just imagine people fleeing the country to avoid those taxes if they're very targeted on a specific population.
No, absolutely. I mean, in fact, Canada is going through that right now. In the last 8 years, we now have 8 provinces, which are the equivalent of US states. 8 provinces now have a top rate over 50%. And what we've seen in the last 10 years is an exodus of investment capital, which, investment capital is one of the easiest ways to increase living standards because it makes us more productive workers, or helps us become more productive workers. And so that has a real price in terms of our living standards, both currently and going forward. I think the other thing that you raised, which is really important, is this idea that Sweden and Denmark are generally more socialist, which, as you point out, when we look at the economic freedom ratings, which look at 5 different components of economies, both Sweden and Denmark rate very highly on 4 of the 5 measures. Where they do poorly is on the amount of government spending relative to the rest of the economy. And again, both countries spend more than most other industrialized countries, but they finance it very differently. And one of the interesting things I wasn't fully aware of this until we did the work, both Denmark and Sweden have fairly strict rules on balancing their budgets and limits on the amount of government debt that can be accumulated. The US right now is one of the worst industrial countries in terms of national debt. Canada, frankly, has eroded its position. We were in an excellent position, sort of 2005, 2008, excellent position. We've eroded it since then. UK is certainly accumulating debt. So there's many facets of the Sweden and Denmark models that, again, are just fundamentally different than what is either in place in the 4 Western countries we looked at, or, I think probably more importantly, what's being advocated by those who want quote unquote socialism to be introduced in those countries.
Maybe next time our senators that are supportive of socialism bring that up, we should respond by saying, well, then adopt a balanced budget amendment. I can't imagine anybody in the United States supporting that. Last time I looked at the National Debt Clock website, I almost had a heart attack. We're not Japan, but it's ticking up all the time.
Yeah, and I do think that's an important point, Rosie. For someone who says, look, I want the Sweden model, so I want paid daycare, I want fully paid education. Okay, I think then the answer is okay. So you want a 25% national sales tax? And if the answer is no, then I think it's okay. So tell me how you're going to raise that kind of revenue without creating a disincentive for business investment, entrepreneurship, and business development more broadly, which means you can't do a wealth tax. And frankly, you can't do higher marginal tax rates on the top 10%. So if it's not a national sales tax, which I think the research is clear is the best way to raise revenue, how are you raising that revenue? And by the way, you can't just borrow it like you're doing now, because Denmark and Sweden don't allow that.
No such thing as a free lunch. I wish people would learn this.
Exactly. I wish there were sometimes.
So I know that the sample of countries you looked at was pretty small, so it might be difficult to answer a question like this, but it did seem to stand out to me that support in the US significantly lower than, or noticeably lower than in other countries, and the UK seemed to have, much higher level of support. Is there anything that you can think of, maybe historically, institutionally, socially, that might be driving that difference across the countries?
I think there's really two things that, at least when we saw the results, trying to better understand uh, the American results. So I think one, and it marginally bears out when you look at some of the regional data, and I stress marginally plays
Mhm.
out. Um, I would say the Southwest of the United States has a real life example, particularly if you're in a state like Florida, where there's a real sensitivity to Cuba, which
Mhm.
remains technically a socialist country. And
Right.
there's a lot of people who lived through some pretty tumultuous times with the boat rafts leaving Cuba and going to Florida. So I think, unlike many other countries, there are parts of the United States that actually have a fairly sensitive socialist country very close by, where they can point and say, is this really what we want? So I think that's one. I think secondly, though, and this is harder to measure, but the US clearly has a much deeper history of entrepreneurialism. In fact, it's part of your founding as a country, relative to what are three other countries that were all part of the British monarchy, or remain part of the British monarchy. And so those countries never broke away to be more self-determining the way the United States did. And again, I think that spirit of entrepreneurialism within the United States is just more embedded. And I think if you look at patent data and business startup data, that bears itself out that
Mhm.
one of the real strengths of the U.S. economy is the degree to which it is entrepreneurial compared to other countries. So I think part of that, and again, these aren't huge differences between the United States and the other three. But again, when we looked at that, we thought those two things might be playing out as potential explanations for some of the differences.
Yeah, I think bringing up Cuba, that seems right. It's a more salient type of example to a lot of people in the US. It's really hard to get data and information from kind of our modern day socialist countries. We don't get a sense of what's going on in North Korea, but you're right. If you're living in Florida or you grew up in the United States in the 90s and early 2000s, you have examples of people risking their life to escape socialism. Um,
Yeah, and I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important insight, because I wouldn't downplay, and it's certainly my own experience of the power of that image of people risking their lives to leave a country because it is so oppressive. And I mean, I just the amount of memories I have as a young person seeing those things, and then the fall. If you're in Florida or Texas or other states that are close to Cuba, that's still something you see. I mean, it's not weekly. It's certainly not the early '80s,
right,
which was a borderline crisis, but it is a proximate example of, quote unquote, how good can a system be if you're not allowed to leave it?
right. One of the things that you also ask in the study that's not part of the main results, but you also ask people about their support for communism and fascism, which was kind of interesting and a little bit scary when I looked at some of the responses. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I can. I would agree with you. So there was really two aspects of the data. So one was, there actually was quite a gap between the level of support for communism and communism and fascism between 18 to 24 year olds and everyone else. Um, when we look at all age groups, the results for fascism were 4 to 9%, which was a bit surprising, to be frank. I thought it'd be lower. For communism, it was 6 to 14%, which again was a bit surprising. What was more worrying, at least for us, the authors, is when you look at the results for just 18 to 24-year-olds. So support for communism was 16 to 24%, and perhaps even more worrying, for fascism, it was 10 to 16%. Now, the one thing I would say, which we're admitting, if we could go back and redo the survey, what we would do is ask them to define those terms the same way we did in socialism, because I think one of the things we wish we had done is gotten data about how are you defining capitalism. Because as an example, I think some of the respondents conflate status quo with capitalism, and
Like
none of the
cronyism type of
exactly
deal.
and exactly. And then what are you defining as communism? What are you defining as fascism? But even just the fact that you're getting levels of support for fascism, regardless of how they're defining it, is certainly worrying.
Yeah, that is the thing that jumped out at me. And just living in the United States, the political climate is weird, and I can definitely see some evidence, at least anecdotal evidence, that people seem more favorable to something that is just so coercive and harsh for people. Before we wrap up today, I want to just give you a chance. Is there anything that we didn't really talk about or touch on that you think is important to bring up? Any kind of final words?
No, you've done a wonderful job as always, Rosie, covering the full gamut of the study. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for books or additional studies or podcasts or anything that our listeners can dig into if they want to learn more?
Sure, yeah, for sure. So The Commanding Heights, it's a bit old, but it's a book by Daniel Jurgen and Joseph Stanislaw, which is one of the best. It's easy to read, but just a wonderful book about the reality of central planning and socialism, and then the transition to market democracies. I think the more recent book, Why Nations Fail, by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. Again, I would quibble with some aspects of it, but I think generally it's a pretty good book about why do some jurisdictions and cities and countries prosper while others fail. And I think a lot of the things we've talked about, both in the larger project, but also just here today, are in the book. And then lastly, as you know, I'm a big fan of Joseph Schumpeter. I think his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, where interestingly enough, he predicted that capitalism would not survive, even though he was one of the quintessential scholars to nail the nature of capitalism, in that he identified entrepreneurialism as a core component of a capitalist system. But nonetheless, he didn't think it would survive. And what's interesting is the reasons he thought capitalism wouldn't survive, I think in some ways are starting to play out right before our eyes. So for people interested in this idea of socialism more broadly, I would certainly recommend the Schumpeter book.
So thank you so much, Jason, for your time and for this research, which is incredibly important. I hope the listeners today have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And I hope that I get a chance to talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Rosie.
Thanks for joining us for the Realities of Socialism podcast, where we take a deep dive into the consequences of socialism as it was imposed on tens of millions of people during the 20th century. For more information, including infographics, free books, and more podcast episodes, visit realitiesof socialism.org.